With Halloween approaching, it's time to get a little bit spooky, and this episode is dedicated to the only creatures that I will let inside. Welcome to Supernatural Beings. I'm Kat, and this week, it's vampires. For the purpose of this video not becoming its own mini-series, I've categorized it into 3 parts. Definition, lore, and reality. The basic definition of a vampire is an empty vessel that needs energy from another in order to survive. In society, this has been coined to describe people as well. Think the party pooper or your work colleague who gives you their entire life story within 5 minutes. You always leave feeling completely drained and tired and spaced out. The term has also been used to start describing electrical items that need energy or use energy even when they're switched off. Understanding the term vampire and breaking it down to mean energy exchange can help us throughout the video to understand the mythology. Without starting to sound cheesy, vampires have been around since the beginning of social structure. Centuries of stories, maybe originating from true events, have been passed down by one generation to another, eventually providing us with a treasure chest of tales to explore. Folklore that, now in modern times, has influenced novels, films, and even lifestyles. From Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire to Moss Diaries, Daybreakers to... I'm not saying that. I refuse to say that. Twilight. Vampires as a genre hold a place in all our hearts. So where does vampire folklore begin? We all know that each country has their own version of the vampire, from ancient Rome to the here and now. Hopping over to the Emerald Isle, Ireland have their own version of the vampire, which is Abatak. And if my pronunciation is off, I am very sorry. Abatak does loosely translate to dwarf, which is supposed to be showing that his stature is quite small. There are 2 versions of this story, and I've tried to mesh both of them, so this is the tale that I'm going to tell, but as I've just mentioned, they do differ. Abatak was a 16th century chieftain, and he was known for being petty, very jealous, and cruel. He was so jealous that he thought his wife was continuing to have affairs with much younger men. So one night he climbs up his castle walls and sits on the windowsill of his wife's chambers, hoping to catch her in the act. Sadly, he then falls to his death and isn't found until morning by his servants. They bury him in a standing position, which was common at the time for chieftain. It was a sign of respect. What they didn't expect was the next night he banged on the doors of his castle, begging for blood, holding out a bowl and saying, "Open your wrists and give you my blood," because that was all that could sustain him. This continued to happen for several nights. A neighboring chieftain is called in to help, and after 3 tries of trying to rid the village of Abatak, he is unsuccessful, to the point where he then goes to a druid. Depending on the time frame, it's either a druid or a priest. Regardless, the advice is to bury him upside down and impale him with a yew branch. Then to refill up the hole, covering it with ash branches and a massive boulder or rock. Once this was accomplished, it did seem to work, and the village and local neighbouring chieftains were able to rest. The grave of Abatak is still possible to go and see. It is in Derry in Ireland. Also from Ireland is another tale of the Darrig Dua. Again, if my pronunciation is off, I do apologise. The loose translation is red bloodsucker, and this tale originates from Waterford in Ireland. This tale is of a young woman who is supposed to be beautiful and well known for miles around. She has long flowing golden hair, she has beautiful mannerisms and a kind heart, and men travel from far and wide to ask her hand in marriage. But she's already promised herself to a young peasant boy. As you can imagine, such a union between the two was met with anger from the girl's father, and she'd already been promised to a high-standing chieftain. In the marriage, the girl is abused physically, emotionally, and psychologically. The husband locks her away, removes her from society, and has a strange interest with cutting her flesh and making her bleed. Now, this is where the story begins to merge with the tale of Abatak, and many people believe it's either the wife of Abatak or they're just extremely similar. In the girl's torment, she refuses to eat and drink, and eventually she dies. There's something about not eating that has that effect. The girl's funeral, regardless of the husband's wealth, was extremely modest. And on hearing the death of his lover, the poor peasant boy is enraged. Now, at the time, there was a tradition to place stones on top of graves, whether it was to mark graves or whether it was to keep the dead from rising up. We don't know. But for some reason, the woman's grave didn't have any stones. Regardless of this fact, the peasant boy visited her every day, confessing his love and promising vengeance. Whether it was this promise of vengeance or this undying love, the spirit of this woman began to rise up with the images of her former life and the times that she had been cut with all the blood. The young woman rises up as the Daragadua. And as I'm writing this, a crow is screaming on my roof, so if I disappear, you know why. Slipping from her grave, it said that she first travelled to her father and wasn't able to find him. From there, she then went to her husband's castle and found him in bed, drunk, with, and I quote, a multitude of nude women. Of course, this would enrage anyone, living or dead. The Daragdu then attacks her husband, killing him stone dead and draining his body of his blood. This then completely transforms her back into a living beauty, where she then continues to go on a killing rampage, draining men of their blood. And then she disappears. She just goes poof and she vanishes. Where does she go? We don't know. She literally just goes poof. You can't leave a story like that, but sadly I have to, as there is no more information. Heading up to Scotland, there is a similar tale, but this one involves fairies, evil vampiric fairies. They are called the Bavanshi. I have a quote from W.B. Yeats, who is a very well known poet. The fairy mistress seeks the love of mortals. If they refuse, she makes them their slave. If they consent, they are hers, and can only escape by finding another to take their place. The fairy lives their life, and they, the mortals, waste away. Death is no escape from her. She is a Gallic muse, for she gives inspiration to those she persuades. The Gallic poets die young. For her, she is restless, and will not let them remain long in the earth. Travelling all the way back now to ancient Greece, there is the tale of Empuse. She was the daughter of Hecate, and she drank the blood of innocents in order to become extremely beautiful and desirable. She seduced men into sleeping with her, and then in turn would drain them in more ways than one. Another story from ancient Greece is the story of Lamia. Lamia was the lover of Zeus, and by this point, wasn't everyone the lover of Zeus? It said that Lamia and Zeus's children were murdered by Hera, who was Zeus's numero uno and was extremely jealous. On finding out that her children had been murdered, Lamia became enraged and, like other people throughout this episode, sought vengeance. She plagued the surrounding area and drained innocent children and babies of their blood. Coming to medieval Europe now, and vampires were the number one thing. They combined real life hysteria and caused people in rural areas, towns, and villages to start digging up their relatives and get creative. Cemeteries to this day still contain remnants of this time, either with vampire cages, skulls that either have rocks or concrete slabs in their mouths, or missing canines. At the time, little was known about decomposition, so when a body was exhumed from its grave and it said that there was blood either around the mouth or the eye area, it then caused hysteria, and the thought that this person had risen up to drink the blood of the living. The same would go with if the fingernails were continuing to grow. From a modern perspective, and with the knowledge that we have nowadays, we understand that these things are normal. During the Age of Enlightenment and the 18th century, South Europe and Transylvania became clouded in mass hysteria and the vampire killing. One of the most famous tales is of a 62-year-old Peter Blachowicz, who apparently, after dying, turned up at his son's door asking for food. The very next day, the son was found dead. I do have issues with the credibility of this story, but I'm gonna leave it at that. Many of these tales can be explained by rabies outbreaks or premature burials. In England, they actually started to connect small bells to the coffins. Imagine that. It's nighttime, there's fog, and you hear the tingle tingle of a bell. Is it Santa? No, it's Nancy. She's been buried alive. The vampire mass hysteria caused the Empress Maria Theresa of Austria to send her own personal physician into the surrounding areas to conclude whether vampires were real or not. He came back with that vampires were not real. However, villagers still continued to either decapitate or leave stakes in the bellies of the deceased. From Africa in the west, we have the creature of the Adze, which shapeshifts into a firefly and hunts down children for their blood. From the south of Africa, we have the Impondulu, which is said to be a creature that hangs off trees and is slightly bat-like in shape. From the Philippines, we have the Mandurugo, a type of shapeshifter. This was supposed to be a woman who married an disgusting, ugly man who then passed away. She then remarries, and after the fourth marriage, her husband starts to get slightly suspicious and fears for his life. It's said that at night he then sleeps with a knife. One night he feels the sharp pricking at his neck and stabs his knife upwards. Then in the morning he finds the body of his wife dead beside him. Coming into recent times, in the 1960s to 80s, Highgate Cemetery, which is a lovely place in London and a place that I love exploring, was home to a vampire. It caused so much hysteria that newspaper articles and vampire hunts became popular at the time. Eventually, it was said to have been a 15th century Romanian spirit that was wandering around. Heading back to Europe in 2004, it's believed that a Strigoi took the form of an elderly grandfather who had previously passed away that winter. He turned up to his granddaughter's house begging for food. Of course, she was terrified. That's extremely understandable. The next night, the brother-in-law of the granddaughter took out several friends for a hunting party. They dug up the gentleman's grave and took his heart. Mixing this then into a drink, it was said that they gave this to the granddaughter, hoping that this would stop any hauntings or nightmares. Whether it did, I don't know, but the family members were arrested and imprisoned for 6 months. Just this year, in 2022, archaeologists dug up a grave and titled it The Female Vampire. This was in Poland when a woman of very high standing had been buried with a scythe over her neck and a padlock around her big toe. Even though she was thought to have been a vampire at the time and pushed out from society and her body buried in such a manner, this may have been due to the belief that any deformity of the figure was something to be feared. She apparently had an abnormally large toe. Throughout these stories, there is a running theme, even of women that are being suppressed or anyone that does not fit into the average. But where are the vampires in the 21st century? Unless they're a fictional character, it seems that vampires have completely disappeared. Well, they're out there, and to them I say, come out, wherever you are. Just like in previous centuries, where society has pushed against anything that was abnormal or taboo, vampires in this century have been split into two categories: lifestyle and what I have labelled as real. The lifestyle vampire is someone that acts and plays the part. It's either a roleplay that takes up a few hours of their week or their entire life. This leans slightly in with the goth culture, where the two marry perfectly. With real vampires, this is a bit more trickier to explain. A real vampire isn't your nanny coming to chomp on your neck. These are people that either have a deficiency within their body. Think what I mentioned earlier about an energy exchange. That can either link to maybe an iron deficiency or an energy aura deficiency. They split into two categories. You have sanguinarians and psi. Sanguinarians do partake in the drinking of blood, which comes from willing consensual donors, and psi comes from the partaking of another person's energy, again consensual. Interestingly, we can see psi energy and auras through kinetic images. There is also a disease called porphyria where someone actually feels physically sick and physical pain from daylight and direct sunlight. With all of this being said, a couple of questions still come up. Are vampires otherworldly? Were they mortals being punished for their sins? Or are they like you and me, trying to survive after Brexit and staying COVID free? Whichever one it is, be nice to your cashier because you don't know who they might be. I have my own theories on vampirism and the folklore, but I would love to hear yours. And if I've missed anything, please comment below. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm sorry that it's been very long. There has been a lot to talk about, but I have enjoyed it and I hope you have too.